The first time Edwin Hale saw Eudora Talmadge mending his fence line, he nearly choked on his morning coffee, spilling a good portion of it down the front of his work shirt while standing at the kitchen window of the Hale homestead, watching a woman he barely recognized move along the property boundary with the quiet, practiced efficiency of someone who had done this exact thing 100 times before. It was the spring of 1878, and the Kansas Territory stretched out in every direction from Edwin's modest but well-tended ranch like a vast, indifferent sea of pale gold grass, just beginning to green at the tips. The sky that morning was the particular shade of blue that only appeared in early April out on the open plains, a color so clean and clear it almost hurt to look at it directly. Edwin stood at that window for a full 3 minutes before setting his coffee cup down on the rough-hewn kitchen table and reminding himself that he had cattle to feed, a barn roof that needed patching, and approximately 47 other things that required his attention before sundown. He did not go outside to speak to her. He told himself it was because he was busy. He told himself this every time she appeared, which turned out to be every spring, regular as the meadowlarks in the mud, without so much as a note left on his fence post, without a knock at his door, without a single word exchanged between them on the subject. Eudora Talmadge was 24 years old that first spring, a widow of 2 years who had taken over her late husband Robert Talmadge's modest 40-acre parcel that bordered Edwin's eastern property line. Robert had been a decent enough man, 10 years her senior, who had succumbed to a fever in the winter of 1876 and left Eudora with the land, 2 horses, a small herd of cattle, and debts that she had quietly and methodically paid off over the course of the following 18 months by working her property with a determination that made the older ranchers in Caldwell County look twice, and the younger ones look away out of something resembling shame. Edwin was 30 years old that first spring, a lean and weathered man with dark brown hair that had a tendency to fall across his forehead and hazel eyes that people in town described as careful. He had come to the Kansas plains from Missouri 8 years prior with $100, a good horse named Calhoun, and the firm belief that a man who worked hard enough and kept mostly to himself would eventually carve out something worth having. He had managed the first 2 things adequately. The third remained somewhat elusive. His fence line along the eastern boundary was, to put it charitably, an ongoing source of frustration. The posts were old cedar, and the Kansas winters had a habit of heaving them out of the frozen ground every few years, and the spring thaws left stretches of barbed wire sagging or snapped entirely, where the cattle had leaned against the weakened sections. He knew it needed work. He always knew it needed work. He simply never seemed to get to it before the cattle from Talmadge land found their way through the gaps and mingled with his herd, which required a day of sorting that he genuinely could not afford. And so when he saw Eudora Talmadge out there that first April morning in 1878, moving along the fence line with a post-hole digger and a coil of fresh barbed wire balanced over her shoulder, wearing a heavy canvas work coat and a wide-brimmed hat, he felt a complicated mixture of gratitude and something uncomfortably close to embarrassment that he chose to call neither of those things, but instead filed under the general category of minding his own business. He mended the section she had not reached that same afternoon, working from his side of the line, and they were never closer than 300 yards from each other during the entire enterprise. When he finished, he stood and looked east at her retreating figure as she walked back toward the Talmadge house with her tools over her shoulder, and he thought that he ought to say something. He thought this for approximately 45 seconds before going back to his barn to see about the roof. The second spring was 1879, and Edwin had spent the intervening year telling himself that he would get to that east fence line before she had any reason to come near it. He had a good winter and managed to repost 4 of the worst cedar posts himself in November, driving them in before the ground froze hard. He was quietly proud of this when March came around. He was considerably less proud when April arrived, and a stretch of 60 feet near the property corner blew down in a wind storm that came out of the northwest so fast and mean that it knocked 3 of his good cedar posts sideways and left the wire in a tangle that would have taken a man all day to sort out. He saw her coming across her pasture that morning with the post-hole digger and the wire coil and something in his chest, did something he did not examine closely. He was saddling Calhoun in the barn doorway at the time, and he paused with the cinch half buckled and watched her cross the dry grass in the early morning light, her stride long and unhurried, her hat brim pulled low against the glare. She moved like someone who had made up her mind about something and was simply executing the decision she had already arrived at, and there was a quality to her bearing that Edwin recognized from his own best days, when a task presented itself, and he met it without complaint or ceremony. He finished saddling Calhoun and rode out to check on his north pasture cattle, which needed it, and when he came back 2 hours later the fence was repaired. The posts were set straight, the wire was taut and properly tensioned, and she had used a double loop on the corner post the way his father had taught him to do it, which was either a coincidence or the mark of someone who knew what they were doing, and either way it was better work than he might have managed in a hurry. He rode along the repaired section slowly, looking at it the way a man looks at something that has been done better than he could have done it himself, which is a particular kind of looking that requires a certain degree of honesty from a man. Then he rode back to his barn and put Calhoun up and stood in the cool, dim air of the stable for a while, and then he went inside and made himself supper, and did not think about Eudora Talmadge more than was strictly reasonable. The town of Caldwell, Kansas, in 1879, was a rough and lively place sitting at the head of the Kishom Trail, where Texas cattle drives came north and the cowboys spent their wages and the merchants prospered, and the lawmen earned every dollar of their salary. Edwin went to town once a week for supplies, and he knew most of the permanent residents by name and by reputation, which in a place like Caldwell were not always the same thing. He knew the Whitfield brothers who ran the feed store and old Mr. Casper Dunning who had the hardware, and he knew the Reverend Hollis Price who preached at the small white church on the north end of town, and he knew Mrs. Abigail Norton who ran the boarding house and kept the town's unofficial social calendar with the iron authority of a military commander. He knew Eudora Talmadge by sight, of course, and by name, because in a county of perhaps 3,000 people, everyone knew everyone else by both. He had exchanged perhaps a dozen words with her in the 2 years she had been his neighbor, mostly at the feed store, once at the general goods emporium when they had reached for the same bolt of canvas at precisely the same moment and both pulled their hands back at the same time and said "pardon me" in unison, and once at a community meeting about the cattle tick problem that had been working its way north through the territory and threatening the spring drives. He knew she was considered capable. He knew the men in town had initially treated her with a kind of skeptical pity after Robert died, the sort of "sorry dear but you really ought to sell" attitude that men who have never tested a woman's resolve tend to adopt as a matter of unexamined habit. He knew she had disabused them of this attitude over the course of 18 months of work, so consistent and competent that even Harlan Croft, who owned the biggest spread in the county and considered most people beneath his notice, had acknowledged at the feed store one afternoon that the Talmadge woman knew what she was doing. This was high praise from Harlan Croft, who used words the way a miser used coins, reluctantly and only when absolutely necessary. What Edwin did not know about Eudora Talmadge, because he had made a deliberate and fairly energetic practice of not inquiring, was that she was the kind of person who noticed things. She noticed the way the angle of the morning light changed week by week as spring progressed. She noticed which of the cottonwood trees along Bluff Creek leafed out first and which were always last, and she had been watching them long enough to know this meant something about the water table beneath them. She noticed the condition of Edwin Hale's fence lined the way a doctor notices the health of a patient, with a combination of professional assessment and something more personal that she had not entirely admitted to herself. She had noticed Edwin Hale in a more general sense for quite some time. She had noticed the way he rode, which was the relaxed and balanced seat of a man who had spent most of his life in the saddle and no longer had to think about it. She had noticed the way he handled himself in town, which was quietly and without pretension. She had noticed that he never spoke badly of anyone within her hearing, which in a town like Caldwell was considerably more unusual than it ought to have been. And she had noticed, with a clarity that sometimes surprised her, the way he looked when he thought no one was paying attention, a slightly distracted, inward-focused quality that suggested a person with more interior life than he generally let on. She had started fixing his fence line the first spring because it was practical. Her cattle were getting through the gaps, and chasing them back and sorting them was as much work for her as it was for him, and the simplest solution was to close the gaps. She had gone over on a Tuesday morning while she could see from her kitchen window that he was far out in his north pasture, because she had no desire for the awkwardness of being thanked for something she was doing partly for her own benefit. She had not anticipated that she would find the work satisfying in a way that had nothing to do with cattle management. The third spring was 1880, and Edwin Hale made a serious effort. He got out to the east fence line in the first week of March and spent 3 days going over every post and every strand of wire, resetting posts, splicing breaks, retentioning sagging sections with the wire stretcher his father had shipped him from Missouri. When he was done, he stood back and looked at it and thought, well, that ought to hold for a year or two. He felt good about this. He felt, in fact, unreasonably pleased with himself in a way that had nothing to do with the fence and everything to do with a vague notion that he could not have articulated without some embarrassment. April came. The fence held. He watched from his kitchen window on the mornings he had reason to be looking east, and there was no sign of Eudora Talmadge coming across her pasture with tools over her shoulder, and he told himself this was exactly what he had wanted, which was perfectly true, and that he felt no particular sense of anything else about it, which was considerably less true. 2 weeks into April, the northeast corner post gave way in a night of hard rain and wind, pulled clean out of the softened ground by a heifer who had apparently decided the grass was greener on the Hale side of things, and had leaned into it with all the patient stupidity that heifers are specifically bred to possess. Edwin discovered this at dawn, saw the heifer standing guilty and bewildered in his pasture, and went to the fence to assess the damage. It was one post, clean and simple to fix, and he would get to it that day. He did not get to it that day because 3 things happened in sequence. The well pump seized up, requiring 3 hours of his immediate attention. One of his horses threw a shoe and needed to be walked into town to the farrier, and a rider came out from Caldwell in the afternoon to inform him that his order of spring seed had arrived at the general goods store and needed to be collected within 3 days. When he came back from town with the seed that evening and put his horse up, he noticed, in the blue and gold light of a Kansas sunset, that the northeast corner post was back in the ground, straight and solid, with fresh dirt tamped around its base and the wire retentioned properly. He stood there for a while looking at it. The air smelled of rain and green things and turned earth. Far out across the prairie, a meadowlark was singing its 4-note song, which sounds like someone asking a question they already know the answer to. Edwin Hale, who was in the general habit of being honest with himself about practical matters, acknowledged in that moment that he was making things considerably more complicated than they needed to be. He also acknowledged that he had no clear idea what to do about this, which was unusual for him, and then he went inside and made supper and spent most of the evening reading 3-week-old newspaper that he had already read twice. In Caldwell that spring, the cattle drives had started coming through again, and the town was in its seasonal frenzy of commerce and chaos. The Texas cowboys who drove the Longhorns north were young mostly, and spent their pay with a reckless generosity that the merchants loved and the lawmen dreaded. Edwin came to town on a Saturday in late April and stopped at the feed store and the hardware, and then, almost without deciding to, found himself walking past the general goods emporium and looking through the window at the woman inside examining a bolt of blue cloth with the attentive focus that Eudora Talmadge apparently brought to everything she did. He went inside. He told himself he needed thread. She looked up when he came through the door, and something passed across her face that was too quick to read clearly, something that was there, and then carefully arranged into the pleasant neutrality of two neighbors who occasionally occupy the same space. "Mr. Hale," she said. "Miss Talmadge," he said, because in 1880 in Caldwell, Kansas, a widow was still called Miss in common usage, particularly by a man who was trying to be respectful and was aware of being watched by Mrs. Dunham behind the counter, who missed absolutely nothing. "You finding what you need?" she asked, looking back at the cloth. "Thread," he said. "I need thread." "Second shelf left side," she said, as if she had been in this store often enough to know where everything was which she had been. He went to the second shelf and found the thread and stood there for a moment. The store smelled of dry goods and lamp oil and the faint sweetness of the hard candy in the jar on the counter. "I wanted to say," he said, and stopped. She had gone very still in the way of someone waiting. "The fence," he said. "Thank you for the fence." There was a pause that lasted about 2 seconds, but felt considerably longer. "You would have gotten to it," she said, and her voice was perfectly even without any edge to it, which somehow made it more of a statement and less of an excuse. "Eventually," he said. The corner of her mouth moved, just the corner. "Eventually." He bought the thread. He also bought a packet of dried apricots that he didn't particularly need because he needed to do something with his hands. He walked out into the Saturday afternoon sunshine of Caldwell's Main Street, where a group of trail-end cowboys were making considerable noise outside the Long Branch Saloon, and he stood there for a moment feeling that he had both said something and said nothing at all, which was a new and not entirely comfortable experience. The summer of 1880 was hot and dry in a way that reminded the older settlers of the hard years in the early 70s, and Edwin spent most of it hauling water to the north pasture from Bluff Creek by barrel on a wagon, which was miserable work in the heat. His cattle were thin by August, and he sold off a larger portion of his herd that fall than he had planned to, taking a smaller profit than he had hoped for, and investing the remainder in a better windmill pump, which he installed himself over the course of a very long September week with his back complaining every morning. He saw Eudora Talmadge at the Wednesday cattle auction in late September and noticed that she had also sold more heavily than she likely wanted to. She was talking to a buyer from Wichita, a heavy-set man named Drummond who had a reputation for offering fair prices to the ranchers who knew how to negotiate and considerably less fair prices to those who didn't. Edwin watched, from the other side of the auction pen, as she negotiated with Drummond for nearly 20 minutes, calm and precise, not backing off her price point. She got within $2 per head of what she was asking, which was better than Edwin had done with his own sale earlier in the day, and he watched her shake the man's hand with the decisive formality of someone who has concluded a satisfactory piece of business and considers the matter closed. He nodded to her as she walked past him toward the teller's window, and she nodded back, and he thought about the fence post in the muddy corner of his east pasture and the 2-second pause in the general goods store, and the fact that she had said, "eventually," in a tone of voice he had been turning over in his mind for 3 months, not because it was particularly remarkable, but because he couldn't seem to stop doing it. The winter of 1880 to 1881 was a hard one. A blizzard came through in January that kept most of the county indoors for 5 days, and when it cleared, the landscape was scoured and white and silent in the way that only deep winter on the plains can produce, a silence so complete it had a texture to it, like something you could press your hand against. Edwin lost 6 cattle to the cold, which was bad, and found the new windmill pump frozen solid, which was worse. He spent 2 days thawing it out and blessing the previous owner of the ranch, who had built the root cellar deep and well-insulated. He thought, during those 5 days of blizzard, about his neighbors. He thought about whether the Talmadge place had the provisions it needed, whether the animals were in the barn and the water lines intact. He thought about this in the abstract, practical way that a rancher thinks about the welfare of the surrounding community, which is a form of concern that has very little selfishness in it. He also thought about it in a different way, which was more particular and more personal, and which he addressed by piling more wood on the fire and reading the Missouri newspaper his sister had sent for Christmas, and not examining too closely why he was thinking about one specific neighbor more than all the others combined. When the blizzard cleared, he dug himself out, checked his cattle, got the pump thawed, and then rode the fence line on the north and west boundaries out of habit. He told himself that he was not riding the east boundary. He rode past the east boundary entirely by accident. He felt certain, and noticed through the bare winter trees that the smoke from the Talmadge chimney was steady and strong, which told him the house was warm and someone was managing it. He felt something unknot in his chest that he had not known was knotted, and he rode back to his barn and put Calhoun up and went inside to make coffee. The fourth spring was 1881, and the town of Caldwell was in the midst of the peculiar fever that preceded the coming of the railroad, which was scheduled to arrive before summer, and which everyone knew would change everything. There were speculators coming through, and new settlers, and a general electricity in the air that the long-timers viewed with the measured suspicion of people who have seen boom and bust enough times to know they tend to travel together. Edwin was 33 now, and Eudora was 27, and the pattern of the fence line had become, between them, a kind of language without words. He knew she would come if he didn't. He also knew, in a way he had not quite admitted until that fourth spring, that part of his failing to get to that east fence line before her was a form of wanting something he hadn't given himself permission to want yet. This was an uncomfortable realization to have on a Tuesday morning while eating breakfast, and he sat with it for a while, turning it over the way you turn a stone over to see what is living underneath it. What he found underneath it was this: he liked that she came. He liked the evidence of her presence on his property, the straight posts and the taut wire and the double-loop corner knots that told him something about the kind of person she was. He liked that she did it without announcement or fanfare or expectation of thanks. He liked it in a way that had grown, over 4 springs, into something considerably more substantial than gratitude or admiration, and which had perhaps been on its way to that destination since the first morning he had watched her cross the pale spring grass with the post-hole digger over her shoulder. He did not do anything about this in the fourth spring. He was still working up to doing something about it, which is a process that some men conduct with remarkable efficiency and that other men, for reasons having to do with temperament and history and a genuine fear of things they cannot control, conduct with a frustrating lack of urgency. He did, however, start paying attention in a more deliberate way. He started noticing, when he was in town, the details that he had been carefully not noticing for 4 years. He noticed that she had a particular way of holding her head when she was thinking, a slight tilt to the right, as if she were listening to something the rest of the room couldn't hear. He noticed that she laughed with her whole face, and that she was precise with her words in a way that suggested she had thought about what she was going to say before she said it, which was a quality he valued in direct proportion to how rarely he encountered it. He noticed also, at the community barn dance that May, which was the first large social gathering in Caldwell since the railway excitement had begun, that she danced exactly once, with old Reverend Price, who was 70 years old and barely mobile, but who had asked her with such evident pleasure at the prospect that it would have taken a harder heart than Eudora's to decline him. She danced with the Reverend with the same focused attention she brought to fence posts and cattle negotiations, and then she went and sat with the Whitfield brothers' mother by the refreshment table and did not dance again. Edwin did not dance at all, being of the opinion that his dancing was something that ought to be kept from the general public for their own protection. He crossed the room twice during the evening, once to get lemonade and once with no particular purpose that he could have named, and both times he passed within 10 feet of Eudora Talmadge and said nothing more meaningful than good evening. But on the second pass, she looked up from her conversation with old Mrs. Whitfield and met his eyes for a moment, and the look she gave him was not the pleasant, neutral look of two neighbors who occasionally share a space. It was a more direct look than that. It was the look of a person who has been waiting for something for a while and is beginning to wonder if they have mistaken the situation, and it lasted long enough for him to know it was deliberate and not long enough for him to be certain of what it meant. He went home that night and sat on his porch in the warm May dark, listening to the creek and the frogs and the distant sound of the celebration still going on in town, and he had an honest conversation with himself that he should probably have had at least 3 springs earlier. The honest conversation went approximately like this: "Edwin Hale, who are you waiting for? What are you waiting for? What is it exactly that you imagine will happen if you simply speak to this woman as if she matters to you, which she does, which she has for a considerable time, which you know perfectly well?" He did not have good answers to these questions. He had instead the reason that men who are afraid of the wrong thing usually have, which is a vague and shapeless dread of change, of being known, of wanting something specific, and having it not go the way you had hoped. He had spent 8 years building something here on this land. He was not, by nature, a reckless man. He made his decisions carefully and he lived with them after. But sitting on the porch in the May dark in 1881, he recognized that caution had its own costs, and that some of those costs were the kind you didn't discover until it was too late to do anything about them. He decided, sitting there, that he would do something. He was not yet certain what that something was, but he decided it with the same firm deliberateness that he set posts or rode a winter fence line. And once Edwin Hale had decided something in that particular way, the thing generally got done. The spring drove past him, however, before he managed to translate the decision into an action, partly because the railway came to Caldwell that June with all the disruption and excitement and practical recalibration that entailed, and partly because he was a man who required a certain alignment of circumstances before he could move, and the summer of 1881 was too crowded and too loud for the kind of conversation he had in mind. The 5th spring, 1882, started with something that shook the quiet surface of his intentions. March of 1882 brought a new settler to the parcel on the north side of the Talmadge property, a man named Chester Flint, who had come down from Nebraska with a section claim and a considerable opinion of himself that was not quite supported by the evidence of his work. Chester Flint was 35 years old, moderately well-looking in a florid, overconfident way, and had been widowed the previous year, and he arrived in the neighborhood with the apparent intention of surveying the available women of marriageable age and making a selection in a timely fashion. Edwin heard about Chester Flint first from the Whitfield brothers at the feed store, who described him as a man who could talk the paint off a fence, and then he encountered him himself at the hardware store, where Flint was engaged in a lengthy and largely one-sided conversation with old Mr. Dunning about the comparative quality of Nebraska versus Kansas soil that suggested he had a particular relationship with the sound of his own voice. He also saw Chester Flint, on a Wednesday afternoon in late March, riding across the open grass toward the Talmadge property line on a showy dun horse, wearing a clean shirt that was conspicuously clean for a working day, and Edwin felt something move through him that he identified, after a moment, as a feeling he had not expected to feel and did not particularly appreciate feeling. He was jealous. It was simple and clear, and he had no idea what to do with it except recognize it for what it was. He watched Chester Flint ride up to Eudora's fence and call out toward the house, and he watched Eudora come out onto her porch and listen to whatever Flint was saying, and he watched the conversation go on for several minutes before she went back inside, and Flint turned his horse and rode away with the air of a man who felt the morning had gone reasonably well. Edwin went back to what he was doing, which was mending a harness, and spent the next hour mending it very thoroughly. He asked, with studied casualness, at the feed store the following week, whether anyone knew what Flint had been about, and Will Whitfield, who was 19 and had none of the social restraint that age and experience eventually teach, told him cheerfully that Chester Flint had been calling on Eudora Talmadge with intentions that the man himself had declared to be thoroughly honorable. "She's not encouraging him," Will added, with the authoritative certainty of a young man who has gotten this information secondhand and therefore considers it completely reliable. "My mother says she was polite, but she's been polite to all of them. It doesn't mean anything. All of them," Edwin said before he could stop himself. "Oh, sure," Will said, apparently delighted to have captured an audience. "There's been 2 or 3. Harlan Croft's cousin was out there in the fall. She turned him down flat, mother says, and that cattle buyer from Wichita sent a letter." Edwin thought about this for the rest of the day in a way that was not entirely comfortable but was perhaps somewhat clarifying. The 5th spring brought Eudora to his fence line in the 2nd week of April, as reliably as it always had. He saw her coming from his kitchen window and made a decision of the irreversible kind, the kind that comes when a man has been standing at a precipice long enough that the standing has become more exhausting than the jumping. He put on his hat and went outside. She was 20 feet from the first problem post when she heard him coming across the dry grass and looked up, and her face went through a brief sequence of expressions that he did not have time to read fully, but which included something he thought might have been surprise, something else that might have been something warmer, and then the pleasant neutrality that she wore like a practiced coat. "Mr. Hale," she said. "Miss Talmadge," he said, stopping about 6 feet from her, which was the distance between them that felt respectful and not overly formal. He was aware that his hands were doing nothing in particular, which felt conspicuous, and he put one of them in his coat pocket and let the other one be. She waited. She was very good at waiting, he had noticed. She could stand in a silence the way you stand in a room, as if she had furnished it herself and was perfectly comfortable in it. "I thought I'd help," he said, "if you're of a mind to let me." She looked at him steadily for a moment. Then she looked down at the post she had been approaching, and she looked at the coil of wire on her shoulder, and she looked back at him. "You know how to set a corner post," she said. "I do," he said. "Then take the post hole digger," she said, and handed it to him, and that was the beginning. They worked along the east fence line for 4 hours that April morning, moving from post to post and section to section, and they talked while they worked the way people talk when their hands are occupied and their eyes are on something else, which is a different kind of talking than the kind done face to face in a parlor. It is more honest talking, as a general rule, because the hands being busy takes the pressure off the face. She told him that the winter had been difficult, that she had lost the old gray gelding she'd had since before Robert died, and that she had been thinking about whether to expand her herd or put the eastern pasture into hay production. He told her about the windmill and the dry summer of 1880, and the plans he had been turning over for improving the water situation in the north pasture. He told her about his sister in Missouri who wrote twice a year with aggressive cheerfulness about her 4 children, and she told him about her mother in Iowa who worried constantly and wrote letters full of gentle suggestions that Eudora come back east. "Will you?" he asked, resetting the last post in the line, driving it with the iron-shod pounder while she held the wire taut. "Go back east." She was quiet for a moment. "I built something here," she said finally. "It took a long time to get it right. I don't leave things I've worked for." He looked at her then because there was something in the way she said it that stopped him, and she was looking at the fence post, not at him, but there was a color in her face that the morning light and physical work could not entirely account for. "No," he said, "I don't suppose you do." They finished the fence line by midday, and he carried her tools back to his barn to get his horse, and offered to ride back with her across the property line to her place, which was a 20-minute ride and also approximately 10 minutes out of his way, and she said yes without making it complicated, which he appreciated. They rode side by side across the spring grass in the noon light, and he was aware of everything. The sound of her horse's hooves on the soft earth, the way she sat in the saddle with that same easy balance he had admired from a distance, the smell of turned earth and new grass and spring air that seemed to carry everything at once. She asked him about the eastern boundary survey he had mentioned, and he answered, and she told him about a problem she was having with the south drainage, and he thought he might know a solution. And by the time they reached her fence, he was aware that he had not felt this comfortable in conversation with anyone in a very long time, possibly ever, and that this was both a good thing and a thing that made him acutely conscious of how much he stood to lose by doing this badly. He stopped at her gate. She opened it and rode through and stopped on the other side and looked at him across the fence. "Thank you," she said, "for helping. I should have been doing it all along," he said. She looked at him with that direct look again, the one from the barn dance, and this time he did not let himself look away from it. "Yes," she said, "you should have." He rode home with that answer sitting in his chest like a coal in a stove, warm and specific, and requiring very little additional interpretation. He came back the next Saturday with a bushel of early apples from the store and a somewhat elaborate plan to call on her properly, which fell apart almost immediately when he arrived to find her in the corral, trying to get a splint on a horse that had pulled a fetlock and was not cooperating. He put the apples on her porch and climbed the fence and helped her hold the horse while she worked, and they spent an hour doing that, and by the end of it they were both considerably messier than they had been at the start, and she was laughing at something he had said about the horse's opinions, and he thought that of all the ways he had imagined this conversation going, this was better than most of them. "I brought apples," he said, because he felt this ought to be mentioned. She looked at him with grass in her hair and mud on her sleeve, and something bright in her dark eyes that he recognized as amusement with warmth underneath it. "I noticed," she said, "on the porch." "I was going to present them more formally," he said. "There was a plan." "Tell me about the plan," she said, letting the horse free into the corral and watching it limp indignantly away. "It involved a decent amount more dignity than this," he said. She laughed at that, fully and without restraint, and he thought that this was the first time he had heard her laugh that way, and that it was a sound he would like to hear considerably more of, and he told her so, in different words, with more caution, but he told her. She went quiet for a moment, looking at him over the corral fence with the kind of attention she gave to things that required her to take them seriously. "Edwin Hale," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and the way she said it, as if she had been holding it for a while and was now deciding to set it down somewhere she could find it again, made something in him very still. "Eudora," he said, and let it be as simple as that. They were quiet for a moment that had an entirely different quality than the silence of the fence line. This was a silence of arrival, of two people who had been traveling in the same direction for an unreasonably long time and had just now stopped at the same place. "I have been," she began, and then stopped and seemed to choose her next words with care. "I have wondered for quite a while whether you were ever going to say something." "I was slow," he said. "You were very slow," she agreed, and there was no cruelty in it, just honesty, and he received it as it was intended. "I'm saying something now," he said. "You are," she said. "I would like to call on you," he said, "properly, with your permission, regularly if you're willing." She looked at him for a moment with her head tilted slightly to the right, that listening posture he had memorized over 5 springs of watching her, and then she said, "I'm willing," and smiled at him in a way that was not the pleasant neutrality and was not the careful assessment, but was something more personal and more deliberate than either, and he felt the whole of the past 5 years settle into a shape that made sense in a way that the individual pieces of it never quite had. He came back the following Sunday and the Sunday after that, and the Sunday after that. He brought apples and once a length of calico from the general goods store that she had been looking at, and once he brought nothing at all except himself, which she told him, on that particular occasion, was the best of the three. They sat on her porch in the warm May evenings, and he discovered that Eudora Talmadge was a person with opinions, which he had suspected, and that those opinions were interesting and sometimes surprising, which he had also suspected, and that she had a way of listening to him that made him feel that what he was saying was worth saying, which was something he had not known he was missing until he had it. She had grown up in Iowa, the third of 5 children of a farming family that had done adequately but not more than adequately. She had met Robert Talmadge when she was 19 at a church social and had married him the following year. She described Robert as a good man who had not been suited to the hardness of the frontier life and who had worked himself past his strength trying to meet it anyway, and there was a grief in the way she spoke of him that was honest and contained, the grief of a woman who has had time to understand the shape of her loss. "Were you happy?" Edwin asked her once, on a June evening when the light was long and gold and the meadowlarks were going in the grass. She considered it. "I was content," she said. "Robert was kind to me. I was building something. I didn't ask myself about happy very much those years." "Do you now?" he said. She looked at him sideways with the evening light in her eyes. "More lately," she said. "Yes." He reached across the space between the porch chairs and took her hand, which was not a small gesture in 1882 in Kansas, where propriety had its own weight and its own vocabulary. She let him take it, and her fingers closed around his, and they sat like that in the evening light, and he thought that this was a thing he would carry for the rest of his life regardless of what came after, this specific evening, this particular light, this woman's hand in his. In July, Chester Flint made one final attempt at Eudora's attention, arriving at her door on a Saturday afternoon when Edwin happened to be there helping her put up shelves in the barn, and the three of them had a brief and slightly uncomfortable triangular conversation at the porch gate that ended with Eudora saying, with perfect politeness and absolute clarity, that she was grateful for Mr. Flint's interest but that her intentions were engaged elsewhere. Flint looked at Edwin with an expression that mixed disappointment and assessment in about equal parts, and then tipped his hat and rode away, and Edwin felt something uncomplicate itself in his chest that had been complicated since March. "Intentions engaged elsewhere," he said, after Flint's horse had disappeared over the rise. "Too formal," she said. "Just right," he said. "I was there, after all, only polite to make it clear." She laughed, and he thought, not for the first time, that her laugh was one of the best sounds he had heard in years of living on the Kansas plains, which had excellent sounds, and the competition was not nothing. The summer of 1882 passed in the particular way that the best summers do, which is quickly when you are in the middle of them and with agonizing detail in memory afterward. He rode out to her place on Wednesday evenings and Sunday afternoons, and she came to his occasionally, and they had supper together twice at the boarding house in town when they were both there on errands, which required them to sit across from each other in public and be observed by Mrs. Norton, who took detailed mental notes and shared them with approximately 15 people within 48 hours. The town noticed. The town had opinions. This was inevitable in Caldwell, which was the kind of small community that treated the romantic affairs of its members as both public resource and community project. Edwin received, over the course of the summer, 4 separate pieces of unsolicited advice from various male acquaintances, ranging in quality from the entirely impractical to the almost offensive, and Eudora reportedly received an equal number from the female quarter, though she gave him no specific details. He proposed to her in September of 1882, which was the 6th autumn since he had first seen her cross his pasture with the post-hole digger, and the evening of it was so unremarkable in its setting that he knew he would remember it always precisely because of that. The two of them sitting on his porch after supper, the sky going dark in the west, the air cooling toward the first edge of autumn, a horse moving in the barn, the creak audible in the quiet. He said, "Eudora," and she turned to look at him, and he said, "I have been in love with you, I think, for a very long time. Longer than I admitted to myself, and considerably longer than I showed it, which I am sorry for, because you deserved better than a man standing on the other side of a fence line watching you do work he should have been doing and not finding the courage to say what he meant." She was very still. "I'm saying it now," he said. "If you'll have me, I would like to spend the rest of my life saying it, loud enough that there's no question, and often enough that there's no doubt." She looked at him for a long moment in the evening dark, and her face in the last light of dusk was so particular and so familiar and so precisely itself that he felt the full weight of 6 springs and 6 years and every careful distance he had kept, and he thought that if she said no, he would accept it honestly and carry it honestly, but that he hoped very much she would not say no. "You talked about courage," she said, "but you came out of that house the 5th spring. I want you to know that I noticed that I was not going to wait a 7th year. You were counting," he said. "Of course I was counting," she said. "Eudora," he said, "will you marry me?" "Yes," she said, simply and directly, which was entirely in keeping with everything he knew about her, and which was the best word he had ever heard in his life. He leaned across the space between them and kissed her for the first time, there in the September dark on his porch with the autumn coming in across the grass, and it was a careful and deliberate kiss, the kind that says, "I mean this and I have meant it for a long time, and I am not going back to the other side of that fence." And she kissed him back with a warmth and a clarity that matched his own, and he thought that 6 years was a very long time and also exactly long enough. They were married on the 15th of November, 1882, in Reverend Holly Price's small white church on the north end of Caldwell's Main Street. The day was cold and clear, one of those November days in Kansas when the sky is so blue and the light so slanted and brilliant that everything looks a little more itself than usual, a little more precisely rendered. Eudora wore a dress of dark blue wool, and Edwin wore his best coat and a new tie that he had let Mrs. Norton help him choose because he wanted to get it right, and the church was full of most of the permanent population of Caldwell, plus a number of outlying ranchers and settlers who came into town partly for the event, and partly because an excuse to come to town in November was not something anyone passed up lightly. Reverend Price, who was 70 and had known Edwin for 7 years and Eudora for 4, married them with the practiced warmth of a man who has presided over enough beginnings to know they matter. And when he asked Edwin if he took this woman, Edwin said he did with a forthrightness that made Will Whitfield, standing in the pew to his left, whisper something to his brother that caused the older Whitfield to elbow him sharply. Eudora said, "I do," looking directly at Edwin, which was how she did everything, and he looked back at her with the complete attention of a man who intends to keep looking for a long time and is just now beginning. They had the reception at the Long Branch, which the proprietor had somewhat reluctantly transformed for the afternoon by the strategic addition of tables and food, and the removal of several fixtures that were not consistent with a celebration of the matrimonial kind. The entire town came through, as it generally did, because in a frontier town a wedding was both occasion and community ritual, a declaration that people intended to stay, to build, to be here in the years ahead. Harlan Croft, who attended and said nothing to anyone, pressed Edwin's hand on the way out with a grip that said what he wasn't going to put into words, which Edwin understood and appreciated. Old Mr. Dunning cried at the dessert table, because he cried at all weddings and had been doing so since his own wife died, and had never offered an explanation. Mrs. Norton gave a toast that was both gracious and contained 3 jokes at Edwin's expense that he accepted in the spirit they were intended, which was affectionate and not entirely wrong. The Whitfield brothers played fiddle and guitar for the dancing, and Eudora danced with Edwin, who had been privately practicing, which was either charming or evidence of a character improvement she had inspired, and she leaned toward the latter and told him so. And he laughed and held her hand, and led her through the steps with the careful concentration of a man who has never been accused of natural grace, but is making up for it with effort and intention. They rode home in Edwin's wagon that evening, west out of Caldwell into the November dark, the stars immense and close over the flat land, their breath visible in the cold air. Eudora sat beside him with her shoulder against his and her hand through his arm, and the land stretched out around them dark and silver and familiar, and Edwin thought that this was his, all of it, the land and the night and this woman beside him, and he felt it settle into him the way good things settle when you have waited long enough for them. The spring of 1883 was the first spring of their married life, and Edwin got to the east fence line in March, alone, methodically working from north to south in the clean, early spring air. Eudora saw him from her kitchen window, which was now his kitchen window also, since they had settled the question of which house to live in by spending one afternoon walking through both of them, and concluding that his was larger and better situated, and that the Talmadge house could be put to a different use, perhaps housing a hired hand when the time came. She watched him through the window with her coffee cup in her hand, and something she recognized as contentment, deep and quiet and particular. She brought him coffee at mid-morning, and they sat on the tailgate of the wagon together and drank it, and he was warm from the work, and she was bright-eyed from the fresh air, and the meadowlarks were going in the new grass, and he said, "I figure I've been owing this fence line about 6 years of attention." "I'd say more like 8, she said pleasantly, "but 6 is a good start." He looked at her and she looked at him, and they were both smiling in the way of people who have permission to smile at each other, which is a specific and excellent kind of smiling. "You could have told me," he said. "When you first started coming over, you could have knocked on the door." "You could have come outside," she said. "I watched you stand at that kitchen window for a full 3 minutes the first morning. I knew you saw me." He was quiet for a moment. "You were in the 5th minute," he said. "I had to go feed the cattle." "The cattle," she said, putting a specific tone on it that required no elaboration. "The cattle," he confirmed, and she laughed and bumped her shoulder against his, and he thought that this was precisely what the rest of his life was going to be like, and he had no objections to any part of it. That summer they combined the herds officially, and began the process of merging 2 neighboring operations into one larger and more efficient ranch that occupied the full extent of both properties. It was practical work and considerable work, involving fencing adjustments and water rights, and a renegotiation of grazing patterns that kept them both busy through the hot months. But it was the kind of work that is satisfying in direct proportion to how much it is shared, and they were good at working together, which neither of them had been entirely certain of in advance, and which they both discovered with something that was partly relief and partly its own kind of joy. She was direct and efficient and had opinions about the right way to do things that were usually correct, which he appreciated and occasionally argued with, and he was thorough and patient, and had a way of slowing down when a problem needed slowing down, which she appreciated and occasionally found maddening. They argued twice that summer, once about the placement of a new water trough in the east pasture, and once about a cattle buyer from Abilene who Edwin didn't trust on instinct, and Eudora wanted to give a fair hearing. And in both cases they were each partly right and partly wrong, and they arrived at this conclusion without too much damage to either position, which seemed to Edwin like the best possible outcome of any argument. Mrs. Norton told everyone in town that the Hales were getting along well, which meant that she had seen them in town 3 times, and that they appeared to genuinely like each other, which was perhaps not universal among the married couples of Caldwell, and was therefore noted as a particular positive. By autumn of 1883, the ranch was running as a unified operation, and Edwin had hired a young man named Tommy Redding as a hand, a 20-year-old from Texas who was a good rider and a willing worker, and who treated Eudora with a respectful regard that Edwin noted approvingly. Tommy Redding lived in the old Talmadge house, which they had fixed up for the purpose, and he made himself useful in the way that good hired hands do, quietly and without requiring constant direction. In December of 1883, Eudora told Edwin she was expecting a child. He was in the barn at the time, sorting harness, and she came in with her coat buttoned to the chin and her breath in clouds and said it plainly, because she was Eudora and plain speaking was her natural register. And he set down the harness and looked at her, and the expression on his face was apparently something she had not seen before, because she smiled at him with the full directness of her smile and said, "Are you all right?" "Yes," he said. "Better than all right." He crossed the barn and took her face in his hands, cold as they were from the November air, and kissed her forehead and then her cheek and then her mouth, and then held her against him in the dim barn with the horses moving quietly in their stalls and the winter light coming through the gaps in the boards. And he thought about the fence line and the 5 years of watching from a careful distance, and how the distance had finally closed, and how everything on the other side of it had turned out to be more than he had known how to want. Their son was born in August of 1884, on a hot August morning when the Kansas sky was white with heat, and the cicadas were going so loud in the cottonwoods that Edwin, pacing the porch while the midwife was inside, could barely hear himself think. He was named Henry Robert Hale, the first name for Edwin's father and the middle name for Robert Talmadge, which Eudora had suggested, and which Edwin agreed to without a moment's hesitation, because he understood what it meant to her, and because he was not a man who made small gestures when large ones were available. Henry was a dark-eyed and remarkably opinionated child from the earliest weeks, expressing views about feeding schedules and the temperature of his blankets with a directness that Eudora said she had no idea where he got from, and Edwin found this deeply amusing. He held his son in the evenings and walked the porch with him and talked to him about the land, which was something his own father had done with him, and which he had carried all the way from Missouri, the memory of it. The ranch prospered in 1885 and 1886. The cattle market had its uncertainties, as it always did, but the combined operation was more resilient than either of the two smaller ranches had been independently, and Edwin had made the investment in the windmill system that paid back steadily in reduced labor and better cattle condition through the dry summers. He and Eudora worked well in the particular way of partners who have matched their rhythms to each other, knowing when to ask and when to simply do, and when to let the other person have the room to work something out on their own. Caldwell changed around them through these years, as frontier towns do. The cattle drives were beginning to thin by the mid-'80s, as the railheads moved further south and west, and the open range began giving way to fenced pastures across the territory. The wildness that had characterized the town in its peak Kisham Trail years, the long-haired cowboys and the Saturday night violence and the loose, raucous energy of a place that considered itself provisional, began to settle into something more permanent, more domestic, more attentive to its own future. New families came. The school, which had been a single room and a sometimes teacher, became more regular. The church expanded. The newspaper took itself more seriously. Edwin and Eudora moved through these changes with the particular equanimity of people who had built something real and knew it, who had worked for what they had, and were not inclined to take it lightly. They were known in Caldwell as solid people, reliable people, the kind of neighbors you could count on when your pump failed or your winter stores ran short, and they took this reputation seriously because it was the reputation they had each individually maintained before they had each other, and the combination of them had only made it more so. In the spring of 1887, they found themselves at the east fence line together on a morning so clear and clean it seemed to have just been made, working their way along the line that had once been the boundary between two separate lives, and was now simply the eastern edge of one combined thing. Edwin was driving posts, and Eudora was running wire behind him. Henry, 3 years old now and entirely certain of his own competence, was sitting on the tailgate of the wagon with his father's old hat falling over his eyes and informing everyone present of his opinions on fence repair. "He's going to be exhausting," Edwin said, not without admiration. "He's already exhausting," Eudora said, threading the wire through the staple with practiced efficiency. "He asked me this morning why the sky was blue, and when I explained about sunlight he said that wasn't the real reason." "What did he say the real reason was?" "Heaven's color coming through," she said. "He said Reverend Price told him." Edwin stopped hammering for a moment. "That's not the worst explanation I've ever heard." She looked at him over the fence post with the morning light on her face, and he looked back at her and thought that this, right here, was what the word home actually meant. Not the house or the land, though those were part of it, but this woman in the spring morning with wire in her hands and mud on her boots and their son's voice carrying across the new grass, and this shared work between them, this ordinary and extraordinary thing. "What?" she said, reading something in his expression. "Nothing," he said. "Just looking." She smiled, small and real and directed precisely at him, and went back to the wire, and he went back to the post, and Henry announced from the wagon that he was hungry and could they please discuss this at their earliest convenience. In 1888, Tommy Redding married a girl named Clara Birch from the next county and brought her to live in the old Talmadge house, and the Hale Ranch gained a second household in a more official sense. Clara was a practical and good-humored young woman who became, quickly and naturally, a genuine friend to Eudora in the way that frontier women become friends, built on shared work and shared difficulty, and the particular intimacy of knowing someone's real capacity. Clara and Eudora canned together in the summers and sewed together in the winters, and argued about recipes with the friendly persistence of people who each believed they were right, and enjoyed the argument as much as the cooking. Edwin watched his wife have a friend, and understood that this was something she had needed and had managed without for a long time, the way you manage without things on the frontier, through a combination of self-sufficiency and not looking directly at the absence. The second child came in 1889, a girl this time, born on a blue October morning when the aspens along the creek were in full gold and the air smelled of autumn. They named her June Louisa Hale, June for the month they had first talked properly over the fence, and Louisa for Eudora's mother in Iowa, who came out for the birth and stayed 3 months, and spent most of those 3 months looking at Edwin with the expression of a woman who is revising an opinion she had held for a long time. She went back to Iowa, apparently satisfied that her daughter had made something real of her life in Kansas, and she wrote monthly after that, the letters warmer and more personal than the anxious missives of the earlier years. Henry, 5 years old when June arrived, received his sister with a mixture of suspicion and proprietariness that resolved, over the course of several months, into a fierce protectiveness that Eudora recognized as being very much like his father's general orientation toward the people he loved. Edwin watched his son carry himself around that new baby with all the seriousness a 5-year-old could muster, and felt something enormous and quiet in his chest that he had no name for and did not need one. The 90s came in with change, as decades do. The range was fencing up across the whole of Kansas and the Indian Territory to the south, the great open miles of grass that the Longhorn drives had used becoming settled, parceled, demarcated. The Kishom Trail was a memory, and a story people told now rather than a physical fact of commerce and movement. Edwin Hale was in his mid-40s, which on the frontier meant weathered and experienced rather than old, though he felt some mornings in his back and his knees, the accumulated sum of years of hard physical work in difficult country. He hired a second hand in 1891, a young man named George Ferris who had come through looking for work after the homestead he had taken up in Colorado had failed in the drought. George Ferris was 22 and quiet and good with horses in the particular way that people who have grown up around horses are good with them, not as a learned skill, but as a natural language, and Edwin recognized the quality and was glad to keep it. Eudora had expanded the kitchen garden in 1890 into something that Clara called an ambitious vegetable program, and that produced enough by summer that they sold surplus at the Saturday market in Caldwell, which brought in a modest additional income, and which Eudora managed with the same organized efficiency she brought to everything else. Henry helped with the market stand when he was old enough to be useful, which he had become by his 7th year, and June helped by not helping and by charming the customers in the way of small children who are completely unaware they are doing it. Edwin stood at the market stand on a September Saturday in 1892, with Henry beside him selling potatoes with absolute seriousness, and June on his shoulders looking out at the Saturday street, and Eudora was talking to a customer 3 stalls down, gesturing at a basket of late tomatoes with the clear, precise motion she used when she was explaining something she knew well, and he watched her the way he had watched her, years ago, from the other side of the fence line. The difference was that now she looked up and saw him watching, and did not arrange her face into something neutral. She smiled at him across the Saturday morning crowd, full and without reserve, the way she had been smiling at him for 10 years now, and he smiled back, and Henry, who was not looking at either of them but was aware of everything, said, "Papa, the man wants to know the price of the potatoes." 15 cents a pound, Edwin said, not taking his eyes off his wife for another moment. That's what she said, Henry said, with the satisfaction of someone whose information has been confirmed. The fall of 1892 brought a drought that threatened to be serious, and the winter of 1892 to 1893 was hard in the particular way that hard winters on the plains are hard, which involves a cold so clean and so absolute that it strips everything to essentials and reminds you of what is actually necessary. Edwin and Eudora weathered it the way they weathered everything difficult, with work and with each other, and by spring the drought had broken in a week of good rains that left the ground soft and the grass coming up strong and the creek running clear. Edwin walked the fence line that April, his boots dark with wet earth, the sky enormous and washed clean above him, and he thought about the spring of 1878, when he had stood at the kitchen window with his coffee and watched a woman he didn't know walk across pale spring grass toward a problem he hadn't solved. He was 45 years old. The east fence line was in good repair, as it had been every year for the past decade, because they fixed it together in March, before it became a problem. He came around the corner of the east pasture and found Eudora there, which he had expected, because they had planned to meet at the corner post to discuss the water flow from the spring rains and what it was doing to the low section near the cottonwoods. She was standing with her hands in her coat pockets looking at the water, and she turned when she heard him coming, and the morning light was on her face, and she was 40 years old and entirely, completely herself, and he felt toward her the same thing he had been feeling since the September evening on the porch when he had said what he meant, with all the additional depth that 10 years of actual living together had given it. "The drainage is fine," she said. "The new channel we cut last year is handling it." "Good," he said, stopping beside her. "Though that one post is going to need resetting in the next few weeks," she said, pointing. "I'll get to it," he said. She looked at him with one corner of her mouth moving, and he looked back at her, and they both understood the reference, which was specific and private and theirs. "You'll get to it," she said, the same tone she had used over 20 years ago on a Tuesday afternoon in the general goods store. "I will absolutely get to it," he said. "Within the week. I'll believe it when I see it," she said pleasantly. He reached out and put his arm around her, and she leaned into him in the familiar way, her shoulder against his chest, and they stood together looking at the fence line in the April morning light, and the meadowlarks were going in the new grass, the same 4-note question they always asked this time of year. "Eudora," he said. "Edwin," she said. "I was thinking," he said. "We should get Tommy and Clara to watch the children on Saturday, and ride out to that spot on the creek we found last summer. Take the whole afternoon." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the cottonwoods along the creek where the new leaves were just beginning to uncurl, pale green and trembling in the April air. "I was thinking the same thing," she said, "last Tuesday." "Of course you were," he said. "I'm often there before you," she said, without any sharpness in it, just fact. "You are," he said. "You always have been." She tilted her head and looked up at him, and her eyes were the same dark, direct eyes they had always been, and he thought about the post-hole digger and the barbed wire coil and the double-loop corner knots, and about the way she had said eventually in the general goods store, and the way she had said of course I was counting on his porch in the September dark, and the way she had said yes, simply and directly, when he had asked her. "I'm catching up," he said. She smiled and tucked herself more firmly under his arm, and they walked back toward the house together through the April grass, the new season coming on around them, strong and green and unhurried. Henry was 15 that year, long-legged and serious, with Edwin's careful eyes and Eudora's directness, and June was a bright-tempered 9-year-old who had strong opinions about horses and the natural world, and intended to investigate everything within walking distance. Tommy and Clara Redding had 2 children of their own now, a boy of 8 named James and a girl of 5 named Nell, and the 2 families had grown together in the way of neighboring households on the frontier, their lives connected by proximity and shared work and genuine affection. Caldwell in 1893 was a settled and mostly peaceful town, the wildness of the cattle drive years a generation behind it, though the prairie still had its storms and droughts, and the land still required everything you had to give it. Edwin and Eudora had been through enough of the land's requirements to know them well, and they faced them as they faced everything, as partners, as the people who had figured out how to match their particular qualities into something more capable than either of them alone. In the evenings of that spring and summer, they sat on the porch in the warm dark as they had always done, and Edwin told her about his plans for the North Pasture expansion, and she told him about the new arrangement she was working out for the hay production. And sometimes they were quiet together in the way of people who have been talking to each other long enough to know that silence between them is its own kind of conversation. He told her once, on a July evening, that he thought about the 6 years sometimes. The 6 springs, she said she did too. He asked her if she was angry about it, or had been, and she was quiet for a moment and said, honestly, that she had been frustrated for a while in the 4th and 5th years, when she had been fairly certain of what she felt and not certain of him. But that she didn't spend much time on anger when there were other things available, and that the man who had come outside in the 5th spring and said, "I thought I'd help," was someone she was glad to know, and the 6 years were part of the story, not a subtraction from it. He took her hand in the dark and held it and said he was sorry for the years he had kept the fence between them, and she said he was forgiven, and also that she had considered once or twice just knocking on his door, and he said he wished she had, and she said she hadn't been sure she wanted to be the one to do it, and they looked at each other in the darkness and laughed, a little at both of them. "We are," he said, "a particular type of stubborn." "We are," she agreed. "It seems to be working out," he said. She leaned over and kissed him on the cheek, which she did when she was moved and was expressing it in a moderate key, and said, "It seems to be working out quite well." The years moved through their seasons, as years do, each one both ordinary and specific. Edwin turned 50 in 1898, and Eudora organized a celebration that combined the qualities of surprise and efficiency that characterized everything she organized. And the resulting evening, attended by the Reddings and the Whitfield brothers and Reverend Price's successor, a young man named Calloway who had taken the pulpit in 1894 and was shaping up well, and a dozen other neighbors and friends, was exactly the kind of evening that Edwin would have said he didn't want, and was entirely glad to have had. Henry graduated from his schooling and came back to the ranch full-time in 1899, at 21, and took on the management of the North herd with a competence that made his parents proud and made Tommy Redding, who had been doing it, relieved in the particular way of a man who has been doing something properly, but knows someone else was born to it. Henry had grown into a serious and good young man with his mother's directness and his father's patience, and he worked the ranch with a physical grace and a practical intelligence that made Edwin think of Eudora the first time he had seen her, that quality of meeting a task without ceremony. June, at 16, had decided she was going to be a teacher and was pursuing this ambition with the organized determination of someone who has already made up her mind and is simply executing the plan. Eudora helped her prepare, and Edwin told her with perfect honesty that she was the most convincing person he knew and would be an extraordinary teacher, and she accepted this assessment and went back to her books. The century turned. Edwin and Eudora were in their 50s in the year 1900, and the Kansas plains had changed around them in 22 years of their marriage. The frontier was settled. The open range was fenced. The towns had schools and churches and newspapers and doctors. The wildness that had given the territory its particular character in the 1870s and 1880s had given way to a different kind of life, one with more permanence in it, more infrastructure, more of the domestic web that accumulates around people who intend to stay. They intended to stay. They had always intended to stay. This had been true of each of them before they found each other, and it was more true of them together, because they had built something here that was genuinely theirs, in the particular way that things are yours when you have worked for them and chosen them, and lived in them long enough that they carry the shape of your life. In the spring of 1900, Edwin walked the east fence line alone on a March morning, just to look at it. Eudora was in town for the day with June, who was now teaching at the Caldwell School and came home on weekends, and Henry was out with the North herd, and Edwin walked the fence line in the spring morning the way he had been walking it for more than 20 years, checking posts and wire, and looking at the angle of the land and the color of the grass coming in. He came to the corner post where he had driven the post-hole digger in the 5th spring, standing beside Eudora on a morning very like this one, and he stopped there and put his hand on the post and looked east across what had been her land, and was now their land, and thought about all of it. The 6 springs of pretending he wasn't watching. The morning he had finally come outside. The way she had handed him the post-hole digger without ceremony, as if she had been waiting for him to show up but was not going to make a production of it. He thought about September and November of 1882, the porch proposal and the church wedding. He thought about Henry and June. He thought about 22 years of evenings on the porch and 22 years of working beside her and 22 years of the particular satisfaction of loving someone who was entirely themselves and who allowed you to be entirely yourself and who managed, every day, to be both exactly what you expected and something you had not anticipated. He patted the fence post and walked back toward the house. Eudora came home that afternoon with June, who stayed for dinner and filled the table with the bright, specific energy of a 22-year-old woman who is doing exactly what she intended to do and is not modest about enjoying it. She talked about her students and her classroom and the new reading primer she had ordered from a publisher in St. Louis, and Edwin listened and felt the pleasure of watching his daughter live her life with the same focused intention her mother had always lived hers. After June had ridden back to town in the last of the afternoon light and the dinner things were put away, Edwin and Eudora sat on the porch as they always did, the April evening coming down around them, the creek audible and the meadowlark still going at the last of the light. "The fence looked good," he said. "You walked it this morning," she said. "Not a question." "I did. And it looked good," he said. "All the posts are sound. The corner post we reset in '97 is holding." She nodded. They sat in the quiet. "Do you know what I was thinking about today?" he said. "Tell me," she said. "The spring of 1878, he said. "When I saw you coming across the pasture the first time with the post-hole digger and stood at the kitchen window for 3 minutes watching you and then went to feed the cattle." She was quiet for a moment, and then she made a sound that was equal parts laughter and exasperation and something else, something warm and fond that was beyond both of those. "Edwin," she said. "I was 29 years old and you were the most interesting thing I had seen in 8 years in Kansas, and I went to feed the cattle," he said. "You did," she confirmed. "I want you to know," he said, "that I have thought about this at various points over the years, and I have concluded that I was possibly the stupidest man in the territory." "Possibly," she said generously. "But that I am also," he said, "the luckiest." She looked at him across the spring dark, and her face in the last of the evening light was the face he knew better than any other in the world, every line and angle of it as familiar to him as his own hands, and she was smiling with the full, unguarded warmth that she had always kept just for him. "You came outside eventually," she said. "I did," he said. "That's what matters," she said. He reached across and took her hand, as he had reached across on a May evening almost 20 years ago and taken it for the first time, and she closed her fingers around his in the same way she always had, and they sat together on the porch in the April dark of 1900, with the creek running and the meadowlarks finished for the day, and the stars coming out one by one over the Kansas plains, enormous and clear and unhurried. The same stars that had been there above this land every night of the 22 years they had been building their life in it. The same stars that would be there tomorrow night and the night after, and for all the nights to come that they would sit here together and feel the land around them and know what it was to have stayed and worked and chosen, again and again, the person beside you. Henry married in 1902 a young woman named Ruth from a neighboring ranch, sensible and warm and horse competent, which Edwin had learned was a reliable indicator of character. They built a house on the north section of the ranch property, and the Hale operation grew another generation into it. June remained in Caldwell teaching, eventually becoming the head school teacher of the growing school and writing her father long letters about her students and her ideas for the curriculum, letters that Edwin read carefully and kept. In 1904, Ruth had a son. They named him Edwin James Hale, after both grandfathers, and Edwin Hale, the elder, held the infant in the evening light of Henry's new house, and felt the full depth of what had accumulated here, on this land, in this life, from a morning in the spring of 1878, when a woman with a post-hole digger had come across the grass toward a fence line that needed fixing. He told his grandson quietly, while the room was busy around them, about the meadowlarks and the fence posts and the spring grass, not that the infant could understand any of it, but because some things need saying aloud regardless. Eudora came and stood beside him and put her hand on his arm and looked down at the child and then looked at him, and she said, "He has your eyes." "Lord help him," Edwin said. "They're good eyes," she said. "Careful eyes, the kind that watch things for a long time before they decide." "That's a generous way to put it," he said. "I've had 26 years to work on how to put it," she said. He looked at her, this woman who had walked across his pasture with a post-hole digger on a spring morning and had fixed what needed fixing and had come back the next spring and the spring after that, who had waited, with a patience that was not passivity but something more active and more honest, for him to walk out his own door toward something worth having. "Thank you," he said. "Not for the fence line, for everything after it." She understood. She always had. "Come home when you're ready," she said. "I'll have coffee on." He handed the baby to Henry, who received his son with the particular careful gravity of a young father, and Edwin put his hat on and followed his wife out into the spring evening, down the porch steps and across the new grass, the two of them walking the same direction, same pace. The land stretched out around them in the April light, theirs and made by them, and carrying the shape of everything they had built here together, post by post and year by year and word by careful, chosen word. The meadowlarks were going in the new grass, the same four-note question, the same patient music of the spring Kansas plains that had been there through all of it, from the first morning to this one, asking and asking in the evening air, and the answer always was this: two people walking together through the April light, going home.